posterior pituitary. Whereas for the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, there is also a connection, but that connection is basically a hormonal connection, which means the neurons, there are some neurons inside the hypothalamus that will secrete hormones, and those hormones will stimulate the cells within the anterior pituitary to release their hormones. Okay? So one of the hormones made by the hypothalamus within the hypothalamus, and that hormone is going to move into a very short, like blood, circulation from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. That hormone, let's see which one we're talking first. So we'll call it corticotropin, releasing hormone. Or CRH. So in the hypothalamus, in relation to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, the hypothalamus will either releasing hormone or inhibitory hormone. Right? Just kind of keep that in mind. So one of the releasing hormones is known as corticotropin releasing hormone. Okay. The second hormone secreted by the hypothalamus is called thyrotropin. Releasing hormone, or TRH. Third one is called growth hormone. Releasing hormone. Or GHRH. Fourth one is a hormone we call somatostatin. Or SST. Fifth one is known as prolactin inhibiting hormone. Or PIH. And the sixth one is called gonadotropin releasing hormone. G(n)RH. Okay, so those are 6 hormones being secreted by the neurons found within the hypothalamus. Now these hormones will be deposited into a very short or small circulatory patterns which connects them to the anterior pituitary. And there are cells located in the anterior pituitary. So keep in mind, the neurons that secrete these hormones stays within the hypothalamus. They don't extend out of the hypothalamus. So for corticotropin releasing hormone, it's going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release a hormone we call adrenocortical. That's an O right there. Tropic hormone, or ACTH. So, corticotropin releasing hormone stimulates the cells of the anterior pituitary, one of the cells, to release this hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay? Thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus will stimulate one of the cells within the anterior pituitary to release what we call thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. Growth hormone releasing hormone Just ignore it. It's like telemarketers. They'll call back. So, growth hormone releasing hormone secreted by the hypothalamus will stimulate one of the cells in the anterior pituitary to release the growth hormone, or GH. Somatostatin that's secreted by the hypothalamus will actually inhibit the anterior pituitary gland and prevents it from releasing growth hormone. So soma means body, statin is to stop, so somatostatin opposes the secretion of growth hormone. So these two opposes each other at the same target, right? They're antagonistic towards each other. Okay, so growth hormone releasing hormone is antagonistic towards somatostatin and vice versa. Okay. Prolactin inhibiting hormone is going to have an inhibitory effect at the anterior pituitary and prevents the anterior pituitary from releasing a hormone we call prolactin. Which is PRL. Now, for gonadotropin releasing hormone produced and secreted by the hypothalamus, it now stimulates two different cells within the anterior pituitary to release their hormones. So it stimulates this to release what we call follicle stimulating hormone, which is FSH. And it also stimulates these cells to release what we call luteinizing hormone, which is LH. Okay. All right, so here's 12 additional hormones that you guys need to know. Just keep in mind how the hypothalamus releases these hormones into a bloodstream that then move these hormones into the anterior pituitary and stimulate the cells within the anterior pituitary to release these individual hormones. Okay, let's talk about growth hormone prolactin first before we get into that one. For growth hormone, so there are some of the hormones in the anterior pituitary that are released out. Some of these hormones will stimulate other endocrine glands or endocrine cells. Some of these hormones will stimulate other cells and tissues that are not endocrine, right, to grow and stuff like that. So for growth hormone, one of its primary targets is to stimulate things like the liver or other tissue of the body. So targets the liver. Also, let's say skeletal muscle, bones, and things like that, right? We'll just keep a few. So at the liver, it basically is going to stimulate the liver to release another hormone we call, I don't even know if I want to tell you guys this. Anyway, we don't need to get into that because that's just another hormone you gotta worry about. So stimulates the liver to basically secrete something to help growth. Stimulates the skeletal muscle, stimulates the bones, so therefore all the functions exerted by growth hormone at these type of tissue is to increase body growth. Right? So think of it as an overall encompassing result of that, without getting into too much details about that kind of stuff. But this blue pen is not working very well. That's better. Okay, so that's growth hormone. Now for prolactin, typically prolactin throughout your adult lifetime is not really secreted out in high amount. Prolactin is only secreted during certain times, like when this is like post-pregnancy and you're about to feed your child, right? So prolactin is there to help produce milk within your mammary gland. And because we're not pregnant all the time, and we're not nursing all the time, we don't need to basically have a lot of prolactin all the time. So typically, if you are not with child, then you will produce a lot of prolactin inhibiting hormone to inhibit the anterior pituitary from secreting prolactin. Even when you're pregnant, throughout your pregnancy, toward the end of it, that's the only time you will actually produce and secrete prolactin. During the first, the vast majority of the pregnancy itself, because the baby is in utero, the baby is not feeding off, your mammary gland. So therefore, throughout the pregnancy, the female individual also secrete a very high amount of prolactin inhibiting hormone. Okay, so therefore, prolactin is only secreted when you basically withdraw the prolactin inhibiting hormone, and that's during nursing period, so time when you're breastfeeding and things like that. When prolactin is secreted, its target is going to be your mammary glands. And along with other type of hormones like oxytocin and estrogen and things like that, prolactin is going to increase what we call milk production. Okay, to ensure adequate degree of lactation and also galactopoiesis. So basically maintain the breast tissue, increase or continue with the milk production, and together with oxytocin, it's going to help to increase the delivery of milk so that the baby can have adequate amount of sustenance to feed and to grow and things like that. Okay, so prolactin acts in coordination with oxytocin. So therefore, one of the stimulus to increase the secretion of prolactin is also suckling. So to oppose this, suckling also enhances secretion of prolactin. So if you're the nursing mother, let's say you have a newborn child, and you're trying to nurse that newborn child. Let's say if you have to go to work and you can't really breastfeed your child all the time, you have to use the pump. So that pump simulates that suckling activities. But what we found out was that the mechanical process of the pump that is trying to simulate this actually has an adverse effect on some people because it will shut down the prolactin secretion in the female individual. Kind of weird. All right, so far so good. Okay, so now let's just take one of these pathways, right? So again, going back to the hypothalamus, corticotropin releasing hormone, which is CRH, secreted into the blood, stimulates the cells of the anterior pituitary to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is ACTH. ACTH will move all the way into the adrenal gland. Now the adrenal gland sitting on top of your kidneys has two portions. That's an outer portion we call the adrenal cortex, and an inner portion we call the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex is actually separated into three layers. You have a superficial layer, you have a middle layer, you have the deep layer, right? So the superficial layer of the adrenal cortex is known as the zona glomerulosa. The middle layer is known as the zona fasciculata, and the deepest layer of the adrenal cortex is known as the zona reticularis. Zona just basically means layer or zone. Okay? So with ACTH, it mainly stimulates the middle layer. It can also stimulate the zona reticularis to some degree. So its major site of activity is at the zona fasciculata. It can also have a little bit of activity at this first layer called the zona glomerulosa as well. Okay. So let's just focus on the first one. So for the zona glomerulosa, in addition to ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone coming from the anterior pituitary, stimulating it, it can also be stimulated by other mechanisms as well. One of the mechanisms that stimulate the zona glomerulosa is also a hormone that is part of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Okay, and that hormone is known as angiotensin II. So we'll put it right here. So angiotensin 2 by itself can also stimulate the zona glomerulosa. There's another factor that can also stimulate the zona glomerulosa directly, and this is basically high blood potassium levels. So you have too much potassium inside your blood, it can directly stimulate the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex. Okay? So there's actually 3 stimulation at the zona glomerulosa. One is angiotensin 2, which is part of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. The second is high blood potassium levels, because you have to have high potassium levels in the blood. So therefore, if I'm asking you to relate that as an answer, make sure you place where that potassium level is. Okay, is it in the blood, in the urine, in the lymphatic circulation, in the CSF? Where is it, right? So therefore, this potassium level is in the blood, and that's the thing that stimulates the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex to release its hormone. And the third stimulus to that is going to be adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay? Now, once the zona glomerulosa gets stimulated by one of these 3 type of stimulus, it will secrete a hormone we call aldosterone. So now, aldosterone is made and secreted by the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex. Any hormones made within the adrenal cortex of your adrenal glands are considered to be steroid hormones. And the starting compound that makes every single steroid hormones that we have will be cholesterol. So cholesterol is actually very important for the purpose of your steroid hormone production. Other steroid hormone doesn't have to come from the adrenal cortex, it can come from somewhere else. But for any hormones coming from the adrenal cortex, they are classified as steroid hormones overall. Okay. So aldosterone is a type of hormone that helps to regulate the solutes within the blood. So therefore, we call these guys the mineralocorticoids. Okay. So as aldosterone is secreted out, what's the target of aldosterone? You guys remember?
Distal convoluted tubules.
Distal convoluted tubules. Good. So DCT of the nephron. And also a little bit of the collecting duct as well. Okay, so we'll do a little bit of both. I know we only talked about the distal convoluted tubules, but it might as well give you guys the other target as well. So distal convoluted tubules and collecting duct of nephron. And what does it do at the distal convoluted tubules and collecting duct?
Reabsorbing of sodium, water.
Not water. Increased reabsorption of sodium ions and chloride ions. And water just passively follows that. Okay? So we can put that water passively follows. What's the other function of aldosterone? What do you do in response to high blood potassium levels?
Secrete.
There you go. If you have too much potassium in the blood, you just increase the secretion of potassium. Increase secretion of potassium ions. Okay, so now you can put the potassium ions, take it from the blood and put it directly into the distal convoluted tubules. Okay, so that's aldosterone. Questions? Okay. Now, for the zona fasciculata, because it is mainly stimulated by adrenocorticotropic hormone, it will secrete a hormone we call cortisol. Cortisol is also another steroid hormone. And cortisol is the primary stress hormone of the body. Right? And when we say stress, we don't always mean psychological stress or physical stress. We also mean physiological stress. Okay? So in terms of physiological stress,
when do you guys think we exhibit or we experience the highest amount of physiological stress?
Physical activity.
That's physical.
Physiologically.
Yeah, but not as much during physical activities. Well, sort of a physical activity, but during what time? When?
Morning.
When you first wake up in the morning. Why is it that way? Well, think about it. When you're sleeping, what happens to the vast majority of your cells and tissue? Is it highly active or is it very, very low in activity? It's very low in activity. Even your heart. Basically, if you measure the heart rate and you chart that heart rate throughout the whole night as you're sleeping, sometimes your heart rate can go all the way down to the mid to low 50s, right? Even if you're not like a conditioned athlete or anything like that. So therefore, when you're sleeping, you have the lowest amount of metabolic activities. But as soon as that alarm goes off and you jolt up, imagine you're going from 0 to 100 in a very quick amount of time. So immediately, all your body cells, all your tissue become massively stressed out. Okay, so therefore, if you measure the amount of cortisol in your blood, that at that time, you will have the highest amount of cortisol throughout the day. Okay, in that particular time when you first wake up. So, because cortisol is basically one of the stress hormone, and when we are stressed, our cells and tissue utilizes glucose mainly and exclusively as a mean of carbon source to break down and make energy. So therefore, cortisol is also referred to as a glucocorticoid. It's a steroid hormone that basically helps to regulate your blood glucose when you're stressed. Okay. Now, if you need glucose, now cortisol has a lot of different functions, right? So we're just going to talk about the acute phase of cortisol activities because as it continues and persists, that's a little bit more pathological. Let's say if you're stressed out because of whatever reason, maybe you have like a lingering infection, or if you are, bedridden for a long period of time, or if you're in the ICU or something like that, right? That is basically chronic stress. We're not going to talk about that. We're just going to talk about acute stress. So therefore, for this acute stress activities, if it is a glucocorticoid to help you manage the amount of glucose quickly so that the cells and tissues have that available glucose for consumption, right? Where would you find the glucose storage in the body? Where do you store most of your glucose? That's where you store your triglycerides. Where's the bank that stores the glucose? What's the only organ in the body that stores the glucose and potentially shares that glucose with the rest of the body? Muscle stores a huge amount of glucose, but they don't share it with anybody. All the cells and tissue stores glucose potentially, but they never share it with anybody, any other cells and tissue. The only one is the liver. This is why your liver is very important. So, cortisol goes to the liver primarily during this acute phase of stress. And the function of the liver is to do what? How is glucose stored in any living cells and tissues of the body? As glycogen. So then, cortisol is going to stimulate increased breakdown of glycogen, right? What do we call that? No, glycolysis is breakdown of glucose. Okay, so you guys remember that process we call glycogenolysis or glycogenolysis, right? So glycogenolysis is a process where you're breaking down, you're plucking the glucose from that glycogen and you're releasing it eventually into the bloodstream. So increase glycogenolysis to increase glucose secretion in the circulation. Right? We have to mention the circulation because you're not increasing glucose secretion into the urine, right? So just to make sure. Okay? Good. What else so besides the adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulating the zona fasciculata, which is in kind stimulated by corticotropin releasing hormone, which then stimulates the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. But what is the original stimulus that stimulates the release of corticotropin releasing hormone? What do you guys feel first thing in the morning? What do you guys feel right before the exam, or during the exam, or the impending exam that's coming up in about 2 weeks or so?
Stress.
Stress. Okay, just think that stress is physiological, physical, and emotional stress, or psychological stress, right? The 3 Ps. Okay, stress stimulates the release of corticotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates the release of cortisol. We call that the stress axis of the body. Okay, so you need to release all of these hormones in kind to eventually secrete a huge amount of cortisol itself. All right. Now, if you have an increase in cortisol, keep in mind that these can also have a negative feedback onto the other areas. So you have an increase in cortisol, eventually it will feed back negatively onto the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to decrease corticotropin releasing hormone and decrease adrenocorticotropic hormone, unless you have an ongoing stress that you need to deal with. Okay, so typically, like when your alarm buzzes and wakes you up, you're highly stressed, so all of these hormones are secreted. So when you measure, they're all in high concentration. Cortisol is very high. But eventually you settle down, right? You get up and you're like, oh, okay, fine, take off your blankets and get out and go into the bathroom and do what you need to do. So therefore you start to like kind of decrease the amount of stress. Because now the whole body is basically getting acclimated to this activity. So because of that, the cortisol level, which is in high amount, is going to have a negative feedback onto these areas to decrease everything so that you can eventually decrease the amount of cortisol as well. Okay, all right. So that's cortisol. Now for the zona reticularis, when it is stimulated by ACTH, the zona reticularis will secrete another type of steroid hormone we call adrenoandrogens. The term androgens refers to sex hormone, which is a steroid hormone, but this is a supplementary sex hormone. And the supplementary sex hormone is secreted out so that it can enhance the development of what we call secondary sexual characteristics during puberty and during development and things like that, right? So therefore, the target of adrenoandrogens is basically, we'll call it secondary sexual structures, which is kind of a weird thing to say because they're really not a sexual structure. So what are some of these secondary sexual characteristics that we're talking about during the periods of puberty? So puberty is just basically the period at which that individual is now reproductively ready, which means at that point, that individual can have a life beyond his or her own life, right? Make another child, or whatever it is, which is scary to think about. A 10-year-old child being reproductively ready, a 12-year-old child possibly becoming a parent to somebody. That's a scary thought altogether, right? Sometimes even 50-year-old children shouldn't be parents because you think about the mental state of them. Anyhow, so during the state of puberty, when you're massively growing and all of the sexual gonads are like active, eventually you're gonna develop things like axillary hair, pubic hair, things like that. Those are secondary sexual characteristics, okay? So therefore, you increase the amount of sweat glands, you increase the amount of hair follicles, so it increases hair growth in certain parts of the body and stuff like that. So adrenoandrogens will help with those processes, okay? So the function of this is to essentially increase secondary sexual characteristics. And adrenoandrogen is a lot more important in the female individuals compared to the male individuals. Okay. All right, so that's that. Questions about that?
Now, let's go to adrenal medulla. In the adrenal medulla, we have a bunch of cells we call the chromaffin cells. Now, the adrenal medulla has these chromaffin cells which actually came from neural tissue. And remember, we talked about this once upon a time when we were talking about the autonomic nervous system, right? So therefore, these chromaffin cells were once upon a time neurons, but they've lost their axons and axon terminals. So the only thing they retain is basically the cell bodies and maybe dendrites, whatever, probably just cell bodies. So therefore, when they are stimulated, they will release hormones that are also neurotransmitters. So the main hormones released by the chromaffin cells will be epinephrine. But it also releases a very small amount of norepinephrine. We're going to war out there. Now, epinephrine and norepinephrine, basically the epinephrine comes from the conversion of norepinephrine. And norepinephrine, in order for it to be converted to epinephrine, requires the activity of an enzyme. And that enzyme is activated by high cortisol level. So therefore, when epinephrine and norepinephrine is secreted, what it does is that it targets the whole body. And what it does is it increases systemic, sympathetic activities. Okay? So it prepares your whole body for some possible intense physical activities that's happening, right? So you think about it, let's say if you're stressed out in the morning, or when you first wake up in the morning, why does your heart rate increases? Why does your pupil dilate, right? Things like that. Why does your respiratory rate increases? Well, because you have epinephrine or norepinephrine being stimulated, okay? And that is coupled with the cortisol that now release a huge amount of glucose so that it can allow for these stressed or these potential increase in metabolic activities of your cells to pick up the glucose, to use it, to break it down, to make ATP, so that it can prepare itself for whatever physical activities that you are gonna engage in, right? Because going from sleeping to awake, that's a lot of physical activities that you need to impose onto your body, okay? So epinephrine, norepinephrine, coupled together with cortisol, very important for any of those stress type of activities, okay? Because when you try and run away from that bear that's trying to eat you, you better believe you're more stressed than if you were sitting for a final exam in physiology, okay? Because there's stress called psychological stress, and there's also stress called psychological and physical stress with the fear of life, like, you know, you fear for your life kind of thing, right? So there's a component of fear associated with that stress oftentimes. And if there's a fear associated with that stress, typically it's gonna stimulate that chromaffin cells within the adrenal medulla to release these particular hormones. Okay? All right, so therefore, what do you guys think will stimulate the chromaffin cells? Well, of course, stress, but what is one of the direct stimulation of the chromaffin cells? It's part of your sympathetic activities, right? So remember one of the pathway of the sympathetic nerves. So you can have sympathetic, preganglionic neurons. Stimulating the chromaffin cells. What kind of neurotransmitters are secreted by the sympathetic preganglionic neurons? Acetylcholine. So what kind of receptors are found on the chromaffin cells to pick up that acetylcholine? Are you sure? No. What if Okay, what if I tell you that acetylcholine secreted by this preganglionic neurons
when it acts on the chromatin cells, will always produce a depolarization effect. Then, what kind of receptors would that be? Absolutely nicotinic. Okay? Because nicotinic will always produce a depolarization effect. Muscarinic, muscarinic will produce either a depolarization or a hyperpolarization, depends on where it's located. Okay. All right, good. So that takes care of that. Questions? Okay. Let's move on to reading. Let me move these guys a little bit further down. Okay, so within the thyroid gland, there's two areas, and it's dominated by two different types of cells. One of these cells is referred to as the follicular cells. Okay, follicular cells just basically means cells that form a follicle. That's it. So therefore, if you guys are supposed to, or when you're asked to identify these cells, please call them the follicular cells of the thyroid gland. Okay, and then there's another type of cells that's outside of the follicle. We call the parafollicular cells, which means cells right next to the follicle. Okay, and then behind the thyroid gland, you're going to have another type of endocrine tissue called the parathyroid gland. Don't know why they don't find a different name for these particular glands, because parathyroid can be confused with parafollicular cells of the thyroid glands. Whatever. So just make sure you guys don't mistake those. All right, so with the thyroid gland, one of the main hormones that stimulate that will be TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, comes from the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so we have TSH, which will stimulate only the follicular cells of the thyroid gland. It does not stimulate the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland, so only the follicular cells of the thyroid gland. Now, when the follicular cells of the thyroid gland is stimulated, it will eventually secrete what we call thyroid hormones. How the thyroid hormones are made is in this way. So imagine you have these follicular cells. So you have these cells, right? They're like cuboidal cells. Now they make a protein, and they secrete that protein, and that protein is called thyroglobulin. Okay. On this thyroglobulin protein, there's a bunch of tyrosine amino acid. Okay. And they also incorporate iodine from the blood. So they take iodine, they put it into this area within the follicle. So imagine there's a follicle like this, right? It's surrounded by these follicular cells, and they secrete this stuff inside of this enclosure, and the whole thing is called the colloid of follicle of the thyroid gland. Now, there's an enzyme that will take this iodine and sticks it onto the tyrosine residue of these thyroglobulins. So imagine thyroglobulin has a bunch of tyrosine. Now, on these tyrosine, you can stick one iodine to it, or you can stick two iodines to it. Okay? So if you have one iodine attached to that tyrosine of the thyroglobulin, we call that monoiodotyrosine. If you have two iodine bound to that tyrosine of that thyroglobulin, we call that diiodotyrosine. Okay, so you have a monoiodotyrosine. We call an MIT, or a MIT, right? Monoiodotyrosine. Or you have two, then we call that diiodotyrosine. So if you have two iodine bound to the tyrosine, it's diiodotyrosine, so DIT. Okay. Now, within this area, there's another enzyme that will take a monoiodotyrosine and couple that to a diiodotyrosine. So if you take an MIT, a MIT, and you add that to a DIT, then you get triiodothyronine. Okay, make sense? So this triiodothyronine is still bound to your thyroglobulin protein within this area, within the thyroid gland, okay? If you take two DITs, the DITs, and you combine them together, then you get tetraiodothyronine. Okay? So, inside there, you still have thyroglobulin. Which is bound to either a T3 or a T4. Because triiodothyronine is your T3, whereas tetraiodothyronine is your T4. So your T3 and T4, should be a big 3, not a little 3. Your T3 and T4 is still bound to this thyroglobulin, which is inside this enclosure here. Now, when TSH or thyroid stimulating hormones stimulate the follicular cells, these cells will internalize, will take this thyroglobulin that has the T3 and T4 attached to it into the cell. So take it back into the cell. And there's an enzyme that will remove this bond. And once the enzyme cuts that bond, it's gonna free up T3 and T4. And these are the only things that get secreted into the circulation. The rest of this thyroglobulin protein gets recycled within the cell and then reconstituted and released back out, okay? So therefore, through all of this process, what's released through the stimulation of TSH is that the follicular cell will secrete a combination of tetraiodothyronine, which is also referred to as thyroxine, which is your T4, and triiodothyronine, which is your T3. Okay? It will secrete more T4 than T3. It will secrete some amount of T3 so that it can work immediately within the body. But the T4 is the inactive form, which gets, once it's delivered to those target cells, it will be cleaved into T3. It will be converted into T3. It's just another way to regulate that. So these are the two thyroid hormones that you guys need to know, secreted out by your follicular cells. So T3 and T4. Okay. When these two hormones are secreted, since thyroid hormone is your primary metabolic hormones, its function or its target, we'll just say is all body tissues. And its function is to increase metabolic activities of all of those body tissues, wherever the target. Okay. Questions about that? All the stuff that I told you guys about down here, you guys don't really have to know. This is just a background information for you guys to understand how T3 and T4 is actually made inside these cells. So you guys don't have to know all this stuff. Just a lot of Jeopardy knowledge, just in case. Okay. So when TSH stimulates the follicular cells of the thyroid gland, it will secrete T3 and T4. And T3 and T4 will target all body tissues to increase the metabolic activities of those cells and tissues. Okay? Now, for the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland, it will respond to what we call blood calcium levels. But will only responds to high blood calcium level. And high blood calcium level can be referred to as hypercalcemia. calcemia, right? So anytime you hear the word emia as a suffix, that refers to the contents inside the blood. Hyper means increase, cal, or whatever it is, calcium, and emia is of the blood. So high blood calcium level, hypercalcemia. All right, now, when the high blood calcium level stimulates the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland, it will secrete a hormone we call calcitonin. Okay. Now, since you have low or high blood calcium level, what do you want to go to? What's your target? What do you think most of the calcium is being stored in? In the bones. Good. So it goes to the bones. But what in the bones do you want to target? Because remember, there's two main cells in the bones. One cell builds the bone matrix. The other cells break down the bone matrix. When you break down the bone matrix, you chew up the bone matrix and you release calcium ions and phosphate ions into the circulation. When you build the bone matrix, you actually pick up the calcium and phosphate from the blood and you store it within the bones itself. Okay. So the osteoblast is going to build the bone matrix, whereas the osteoclast is going to resorb or release calcium, break down the bone matrix to release the calcium. So we would think that, hey, you know what, calcitonin is going to go into the bones and stimulate the osteoblast, right? To pick up the bone, the calcium, and then build that bone matrix so you can reduce the calcium level. But it's actually not. So what we're going to do is that when we get to the bones, we're going to stimulate or inhibit, actually here, sorry, the target inside the bones is going to be your osteoblast. Dude. So osteoclast of bone, and the function of that is to decrease activities of your osteoclast. So prevent any further release of calcium ions into the blood. Okay, that's the first thing that happens. But you still have this high amount of calcium inside your blood. So what do you want to do then? So the second target of calcitonin, what do you regulate? A lot of your calcium. If you have a lot of calcium in the blood, what organ can help regulate that ionic concentration? The kidneys. What part of the kidneys is under some kind of hormonal regulation? Yeah, so distal convoluted tubules. So target number 2 for calcitonin is at the distal convoluted tubules of the nephron. And what it does, it decreases reabsorption of calcium ions. Okay, so it prevents that nephron from taking back the calcium ions, therefore allowing you to release or excrete the calcium ions in the urine itself. Okay, so that's calcitonin. All right, now for the parathyroid glands, which sits behind the thyroid glands, it also reacts to blood calcium level, but it is stimulated by low blood calcium level, what we call hypocalcemia. Okay. So when you have low blood calcium level, now you need to increase the calcium inside your blood. So it's going to release a hormone we call parathyroid hormone. It's not as fancy as calcitonin. I think like whoever made up this particular name, they probably, like I said, you know, probably ran out of drugs by that time. So I don't know what to call them. Oh, I know. It's released by the parathyroid gland, right? So why don't we just call it parathyroid hormone? Everybody claps and they go home. All right. So If you want to increase the amount of calcium inside your blood, where would you get that calcium ions? From the bones. So target number 1 is which cells of the bone?
Decreases activities of osteoblasts.
So you want to stimulate the osteoclast, right? Osteoclast of bones, and function of the first one is to increase osteoclast activities to increase what we call bone resorption. Bone resorption is a process where you're breaking down bone matrix to release the calcium and phosphate ions into the circulation. So you want to stimulate these guys so that you can increase the activities of the osteoclast, so you can break down more bone matrix, so you can release the calcium into the blood to raise the blood calcium level back up. But that's not enough, so therefore you have a second target. Target number 2, parathyroid hormone, is going to be at the distal convolute tubules. And at the distal convolute tubules, you want to increase reabsorption of calcium ions. So you want to take the calcium ions back from the filtrate and put it into the blood to raise the blood calcium level back up to normal. Okay? That's a third target for parathyroid hormone. And that target number 3 is an indirect target of parathyroid hormone. And the target number 3 is in the intestinal, so small intestine. Okay. But this is indirect. Because parathyroid hormone doesn't actually stimulate the small intestine, what parathyroid hormone does is it activates vitamin D. And vitamin D acts on the small intestine. Okay? So the function of parathyroid hormones through the activities of vitamin D is to increase calcium absorption from the diet. Via activities of vitamin D. So parathyroid hormone activates vitamin D. Vitamin D then will stimulate the small intestine to increase the absorption of calcium ions. Okay, so when you do all these, you're going to raise the amount of calcium ions in the blood back up to normal. Okay? All right. Lastly, you have the islet of Langerhans, which are these particular cells or islet of cells found within the pancreas. Now, the pancreas itself, remember, it sits inside the abdominal cavity, has a huge activities in relation to digestive enzymes being secreted into the small intestine for the purpose of digestion. Inside the islets of Langerhans, you have 2 different generations of cells or population of cells. One is called the alpha cells, the other one is called the beta cells. Okay? Both of these particular cells will respond to what we call blood glucose levels. I'm going to move it over there a little bit because obviously I'm drawing a little too much over here. So you have pancreas. Specifically the islet of Langerhans. Okay, one is the alpha cells. And the other one is the beta cells. There's also a delta cells, which we're not going to talk about. Okay. Now keep in mind that none of this stuff, even digestive enzymes, work while they're inside the pancreas. Okay? So therefore, they have to be secreted somewhere, and they work outside of the pancreas, because you don't want these things to work inside the pancreas, potentially harming the cells of the pancreas. So therefore, it will respond mainly to blood glucose level. Okay? Now, for the alpha cell, it's going to respond to low blood glucose level, we call hypoglycemia. Okay?
So when you have hypoglycemia, then the alpha cell gets stimulated, which means you have low glucose level. Alpha cells get stimulated and will secrete a hormone we call glucagon. Since you have low blood glucose level, where do you want to go to raise your blood glucose? What's your target? Liver. That's where you store your glucose. What do you want to do at the liver?
Increase glycogenolysis.
Yeah, same thing that cortisol does. So increased glycogenolysis to increase glucose secretion into the circulation. Oh, look at that. So what then happens? What hormones will be secreted when you have some kind of stress?
Cortisol.
Cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and glucagon. Okay? Why? Because you really need to raise that blood glucose level immediately. Okay? So if you're talking about physical stress, talking about psychological stress, you're talking about any kind of stress, think about it, hunger is a stress. So therefore, when you're hungry, you may not have epinephrine and norepinephrine because you're kind of tired and stuff like that, but you will definitely have cortisol and glucagon acting together. And oftentimes, actually, when you're hungry, you do want to have some of these particular type of neurotransmitters / hormones like epinephrine and norepinephrine, so you can increase sort of like your heart rate a little bit because you're kind of not really active much, right? So maybe that will enhance your activities to go seek out some food and stuff like that, okay? So you don't become food kind of thing. It's all survival mechanisms, right? Okay, so that's glucagon. Now for the beta cells, it will respond mainly to high blood glucose level. So what we call hyperglycemia, okay? So basically after you've eaten a meal and stuff like that, right, you get a high spike in that glucose, beta cell gets stimulated, and beta cells will secrete a hormone we call insulin. If you have a lot of glucose, what do you want to stimulate? What's the target for insulin?
If you have too much glucose.
You want to stimulate the pancreas? For what purpose? It's coming from the pancreas. Where do you store your glucose?
Muscles.
Muscle and
Liver.
liver. So liver, muscle. And what do you want to do at the liver and muscle? You want to pick up the glucose, right? Increase glucose. We'll call it pickup or intake. And how would you want to store the glucose? Store in what form? What's the process of making glycogen called? Come on, chapter 5, guys. That was yesterday. Increased glucose intake, or actually we should put uptake, transport, whatever. And increase glycogenesis, which is basically production of glycogen. Does insulin act on the adipose tissue? Absolutely. So adipose tissue as well. Because one of the things that does happen with your excess amount of blood glucose is that the cells takes it in, it starts to break it down, and one of the shunted process, because let's say if you're satiated and you're full, you don't really have to, do a lot of activities or whatever, you have all this extra stuff that's now being made. So therefore, some of these particular,
metabolic breakdown of that glucose is gonna be converted into triglyceride, so you can store it. So therefore, at the adipose tissue, insulin increases triglyceride uptake. And increase what we call lipogenesis. So storage of triglyceride kind of thing. Okay. We'll call it uptake, not intake. All right, for the glucose also. Right? So increase glucose uptake to increase glycogenesis. Good. What about follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone? We'll wait until we get to the reproductive system and talk about this. Okay, so these guys will be more involved in the reproduction. The rest of it, that's your endocrine system. So learn it well. It'll be on your exam. It's 50 points on your final exam, out of 160 points that you guys have. So actually the endocrine system and the reproductive system, which is essentially just endocrine stuff, is 100 points on your final exam. Okay. The rest of it, 60 points, is going to divide it into the digestive system and the urinary system. Oh, and the group that you guys have now, that's going to be your group for presentation if you guys want to do a presentation. Okay. For you guys, are you going to be here, Matt, for the presentation?
I'm not gonna be here.
So if you still want the extra credit point for the presentation, you can still do it, but I can only give you half of it. So you can still do the research and you can still participate in by, providing these guys with the information. But because the other 5, so it's 10 points for the presentation. So 5 points is for doing the work and the other 5 points is for the oration of it, standing up here and presenting it. You have to talk, otherwise you don't get the rest of the points. So therefore, if you do the work and you give these guys, your part and stuff like that, and they can say it for you, then I'll give you the 5 points. If you want to, you don't have to, right? That's entirely up to you. Now, of course, that goes for any of you guys. If you guys don't want to participate in this presentation, you don't have to, okay? It's extra credit. So, but if you do want to participate in this presentation, then, you have to, let's say when you guys divide out your parts, you have to actually do the research and then contribute to your group. One of you guys would take all that information and basically, standardize it in one format, like one font. I don't want like 5 different fonts. Like it's not a ransom note, right? So please don't give me 5 different fonts of different sizes and stuff like that. So somebody goes in there at the end and just edit all of that stuff for me, okay? You can do whatever you want. You can throw a skit, you can make a little, song and dance, like a production if you want to. You can have a PowerPoint presentation, which is most likely what people would do in a presentation, right? You can have a whole oration when somebody draw all the stuff and you guys just kind of point along the way what you guys want everybody to learn. So on Wednesday, I'm gonna give you guys the topic of your presentation, right? And also the requirements, what you guys need to talk about in that presentation, okay? So you guys let Sukhar know that he's in your group. Give him the hard stuff. Because he's not here today.
So you told me he has to present himself.
Yeah, you can tell him that. Don't be like me. Okay, good. Any questions about the endocrine system? All right. Finish your activities and then go ahead.
Next Wednesday, we're just gonna be presenting.
Is next Wednesday the last day of class?